Welcome to Dialogue.
Today, we are taking a deep dive into the mechanics of international policy, and we're using the long, very intense geopolitical focus on Venezuela as our main case study.
Right.
We're going to try and move past the official press release, the usual story about drugs, corruption, humanitarian crises, and really get into a serious discussion about what honesty in geopolitics actually looks like, or maybe what it doesn't look like.
That's really the core mission here, isn't it? We're trying to uncover the underlying calculus. What is the actual engine driving U.S. policy, especially when it comes to nations that are, one, rich in resources, and two, trying to forge their own path of economic independence?
So to do that, we really have to set aside the morality tale that's usually presented.
Completely.
Yes.
We have to look strictly at the strategic balance sheet.
Yeah.
What are the assets? What are the interests?
Okay, let's unpack that. Because the official story, the one you hear for why there's so much pressure on Caracas, whether it's sanctions or diplomatic isolation or just how the media frames it, it's sort of the geopolitical equivalent of saying, I didn't end our relationship because I found someone else. I ended it because I care deeply about your personal financial growth and, your restructuring.
It was perfect. It
Yes.
sounds so altruistic, maybe even righteous, but the motives are, shall we say, a little more self-interested.
A little more strategic.
Exactly. Our job here is to peel back those layers of righteous indignation and find the specific, measurable self-interest underneath.
Mhm.
And spoiler alert, it almost always comes back to assets and access.
So we have to approach this with a critical eye, maybe even a slightly cynical one. Because the public narratives, the stories we're told, they're almost always built to distract a domestic audience from what's really happening on the ground strategically.
And when you look closely, when you look at the historical patterns, you find this incredible consistency. The stated moral reason for an intervention almost never lines up with the tangible economic outcome that the intervening power gets.
Okay, so let's start right there. Let's start with those official justifications. When the U.S. establishment talks about Venezuela, there are two main arguments that always seem to come up, and they're arguments that are, well, flexible enough to be used against almost any country that steps out of line.
Absolutely. For Venezuela, the first big claim is always framed around lawlessness, national security, and of course, drugs.
The narco-state narrative.
Precisely. The story goes that intervention is necessary because of these huge drug trafficking networks, the cartels, the cocaine routes. The whole thing is painted as this kind of Scarface cosplay, as one analysis colorfully put it.
Right, so it paints a picture of this criminal regime that's a direct threat to the region, and more importantly, a direct threat to the safety of U.S. citizens because of the drug flow.
It's a very effective narrative.
But right away, you have to ask the dangerous question, the one that sort of undermines that whole premise. If fighting drug trafficking was the real, primary, existential reason for this level of intense focus, why is U.S. policy on drugs globally so wildly inconsistent?
The inconsistency isn't just a minor detail. It's structural. It's baked into the policy. If fighting drugs was the absolute #1 driver, you would expect to see the same immense pressure applied equally
To everyone involved.
to all governments involved in trafficking or even just turning a blind eye to it. But that's not what we see at all. The evidence points to a very, very selective approach.
So what does that selectivity look like in practice?
Well, you see, both historically and right now, the U.S. often finds itself partnering with governments, sometimes in Central America, sometimes in Asia, that are frankly openly linked to, or at least complicit in, massive drug operations.
But they're strategic allies.
They're strategic allies. They allow military bases, they share intelligence, they keep their markets open. And in those cases, the drug problem is, well, it's conveniently ignored. Or it's downplayed, or it's handled through some nominal funding program that doesn't really achieve much.
And we've seen this before, right? There are historical examples, especially in Latin America during the Cold War, where groups that were being funded to fight some other ideological battle ended up becoming massive drug traffickers themselves.
Of course. So the war on drugs starts to feel less like a coherent policy and more like a tool, a justification that can be picked up and put down when convenient.
A flexible justification.
Exactly. And then you have to consider the money, the sheer scale of it. We're talking billions of dollars, supposedly, for fighting drugs. But huge amounts of that money just vanish. It's unaccounted for, or it demonstrably fails to stop the flow of narcotics.
So it starts to feel less like a policy to solve a crisis and more like a budget line that justifies other operations.
Like intelligence gathering or maintaining a military presence or running diplomatic pressure campaigns. It's the perfect cover.
And then there's the timeline. Let's just be honest. Cocaine was entering the U.S. in huge quantities long, long before Venezuela became this specific geopolitical problem.
Decades before, trafficking roads shift, production centers move around, but the flow of drugs into the U.S. has been a constant reality. So for the spotlight to suddenly shine so intensely, so singularly on Venezuela, it requires you to believe one of two things.
Okay.
Either Venezuela somehow, overnight, invented the global drug trade,
Which seems unlikely.
or, far more plausibly, drugs are just the politically effective excuse, not the real underlying reason for the pressure.
And it is a powerful excuse. It taps into real domestic fears. It's an easy story to sell to the public, that we have to intervene to protect our own communities.
And that leads us right into the second major justification, what you could call the human rights costume.
The moral overlay.
The moral overlay. This is what gets deployed when the geopolitical theater needs an ethical justification for action. The claim is that severe human rights violations, political repression, a lack of democracy, create this unavoidable moral imperative for the U.S. to act.
And again, that's an argument with immense moral weight. It implies a duty to protect vulnerable people. But just like the drug claim, this humanitarian concern seems to operate on a very specific and highly variable timetable.
Let's call it seasonal morality.
Seasonal morality. I like that. It perfectly captures the dynamic, doesn't it? The concern over human rights suddenly becomes incredibly urgent and politically actionable, but only when a country checks a few very specific boxes.
Boxes of defiance.
What are those defiance boxes?
Well, for instance, human rights suddenly become a top priority when a country's leader actively refuses to play ball with the established global economic order.
So when they don't do what they're told?
In a nutshell, it becomes a crisis when they refuse to privatize their national assets, especially valuable things like oil or minerals. It becomes an emergency when their oil contracts become awkward. Maybe they want to renegotiate them or tax them or nationalize them completely.
And the big one?
And the really big one? Yes. When the country says no thank you to the loans and the mandatory structural adjustments that come from international financial institutions like the IMF.
It's like a switch gets flipped. A country could have a questionable human rights record for years, but as long as it was economically compliant, it was fine. The moment it asserts economic independence,
It's suddenly an intolerable moral crisis. And the reverse is just as telling.
How so?
The same human rights concerns that trigger action against an independent state just seem to evaporate when they involve an allied nation. A nation where strategic interests are being served.
So if the oil's flowing or we have a military base there,
If the oil flows, if bases are allowed, if their currency is dollar denominated, and if our major corporations feel comfortable operating there, then suddenly the concern for human rights gets a lot quieter. It's minimized.
so the focus isn't really on the violation itself, but on the political utility of pointing out that violation.
Exactly. The morality is seasonal. The concern about drugs is selective. The official explanations are basically just PR campaigns. They're designed to justify actions that are being taken for completely different strategic reasons.
Which brings us to the core issue. What is that real reason?
Well, the analysis suggests it's not the reason for the action, it's the framing of the action. The real goal is always about power, it's about resource control, and it's about maintaining the current global economic architecture.
Okay, here's where we pivot. We have to address the awkward, inconvenient fact that is consistently downplayed in that official narrative. And it's simply the sheer scale and strategic value of Venezuela's resources.
Let's just state this as clearly as possible, because it really goes against what most people assume. Most people think of the Persian Gulf when they think of oil.
Right.
Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth.
The largest, let's just repeat that because it's
yeah.
a staggering fact. The largest proven oil reserves on the entire planet. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than Iran.
In terms of what's actually in the ground waiting to be extracted, Venezuela is at the absolute top of the global energy pyramid.
And that one fact, just that one fact alone, should be the starting point for any serious conversation about this. It immediately changes everything from a moral crusade into a cold, hard, strategic calculation.
It has to. It's about resource acquisition and access. If any nation is sitting on the world's largest strategic asset, it is going to be the subject of intense and often very hostile geopolitical focus. It's almost inevitable.
And it's not just the quantity of the oil that matters, right?
Yeah.
The specific type of oil is also crucial here, especially when you think about the future.
That's a critical point. Venezuela's resource is primarily heavy crude.
Can you explain that a little? What's the difference and why is its value increasing so much now?
Certainly. So the oil in Venezuela's Orinoco Belt is very different from the light, sweet crude that has traditionally been easier to refine. Heavy crude is dense, it's viscous, it has more impurities like sulfur. Historically, that made it more difficult and much more expensive to extract and refine.
So you need special refineries for it.
You needed very specialized, very complex refineries, and because of that extra cost and difficulty, it usually sold at a pretty big discount compared to the lighter stuff. It was seen as a challenging sort of secondary resource.
But something changed.
Technology changed. Specifically, refining technology, things like hydrocracking and coking, have gotten dramatically better and more cost-effective. At the very same time, the world's supplies of that easy-to-refine, light, sweet crude are getting harder to find. They're depleting.
Which makes the giant reservoirs of heavy crude.
Strategically essential. Its value is growing exponentially. As global energy demand stays high, Venezuela's heavy crude goes from being a liability to being arguably tomorrow's most reliable, long-term strategic oil supply.
So they're not just sitting on a lot of oil, they're sitting on the future of oil.
In many ways, yes.
And this leads us directly to the moment that Venezuela went from being just another developing country to being a problem that needed to be solved. This was when they committed what you might call the ultimate act of resource sovereignty.
Or the ultimate geopolitical crime, depending on your perspective. The decision to nationalize, to take control of their own national assets.
To say, this belongs to us.
To state clearly and unequivocally, this immense wealth belongs to the Venezuelan people and the Venezuelan state. And this wasn't just a philosophical statement. It was a massive, systematic transfer of control.
From who to who?
From the big multinational oil corporations back to the state-owned company, PDVSA. It changed everything about who got the profits and who made the decisions.
And what was the immediate global reaction to that move, to that resource nationalism?
It was met with intense, immediate, and sustained hostility from the big global powers and from the corporate structures that had, for decades, enjoyed privileged access and huge profit margins there.
So when a country nationalizes its resources, it's not just breaking a contract with, say, ExxonMobil, it's doing something bigger.
It's challenging the fundamental premise of the entire global economic order. And that premise is that a nation's strategic wealth, especially energy, has to remain accessible to and largely managed by external corporate entities.
It just completely flipped the power dynamic. Before, Venezuela was basically a service provider for the global oil market. After nationalization, they became a decision maker.
And that was a powerful and, from the establishment's perspective, an unacceptable signal to send to other resource-rich nations around the world. Venezuela suddenly became a blueprint, a dangerous model for resource independence. And from that moment on, they were officially a problem that needed to be contained and ultimately solved.
Solved in a way that would ensure that the largest oil reserves on Earth remained available on terms dictated from the outside, not the inside.
Precisely.
So if the oil is the prize, then these specific actions, these acts of defiance, are the reason for the conflict. We can cut through the noise now and really identify the core reasons the U.S. establishment actually cares.
Right. And you can really distill it down into three foundational acts of defiance. Three things that violated the central rules of the global economic game and put a target on Venezuela's back.
Okay, number one is obvious. Resource control. They nationalized their oil.
Number two, they actively rejected U.S. corporate dominance. And this is bigger than just fighting with one company. It's about refusing to let foreign entities dictate your country's regulations, your taxes, your extraction policies.
And number three, which is a huge challenge to the global financial system, they refused IMF obedience.
And that triad, resource independence, rejection of corporate mandates, and refusal of IMF conditioning, that's the real strategic driver. Everything else, the drugs, the human rights talk, it's just PR. It's the story you tell the public so they don't question why you're really doing this.
Let's focus on that third point, rejecting the IMF, because I think for a lot of people, the IMF just sounds like a bank. So refusing a loan sounds like you're just turning down some help.
But these are not normal loans. They are universally packaged with non-negotiable mandatory conditions. It's what some have called a structured policy, designed to create corporate happiness at the direct expense of public suffering.
The IMF diet plan.
That's a great way to put it. An IMF structural adjustment loan isn't just financial aid, it's a policy prescription. It's designed to radically restructure a nation's entire economy to favor foreign investors and creditors, all under the guise of stabilizing the country.
So what are the specific demands in that diet plan that Venezuela refused?
They're pretty consistent wherever you see them applied. First, Immediate and very painful austerity. That means slashing public spending on everything: healthcare, education, food subsidies,
Second.
mandatory privatization of national assets. This means forcing the sale of state-owned companies. Your water utility, your electric company, your ports, your banks, often at rock-bottom prices to foreign investors.
It's like being forced to sell off the family jewels when you're in a tough spot.
Precisely. And third, a mandated currency devaluation. Now, this might make your exports cheaper for a little while, but what it does immediately is destroy the purchasing power of your average citizen. Everything imported food, medicine suddenly becomes unaffordable.
It sounds like the overall effect is to strip the state of its ability to function on its own and to make it totally dependent on international capital.
That is the strategic goal. When you accept these terms, you are handing over control of your economic future. By saying no, Venezuela was asserting total economic independence. They were refusing to give up control.
And that refusal, that no, is not a decision that comes without consequences. There's a pushback.
Oh, there's an immediate and predictable pushback. There's a potent analogy for this. It says that refusing the IMF's protection deal is like refusing a mafia protection deal and then acting shocked when your store mysteriously catches fire.
Wow.
It highlights the unspoken threat. The loan isn't just aid, it's an enforcement mechanism. And when you refuse that protection, the consequences, economic isolation, capital flight, being cut off from international finance, they are swift and they are devastating. And they lead to the very crisis that the interventionists then claim they are morally obligated to solve.
So the message is clear not just to Caracas, but to anyone else watching. You either play by the established rules, which means corporate access and financial compliance, or we will make your independent path completely economically impossible. And once a country has committed those sins, resource independence and financial noncompliance, the playbook shifts to the main tool of modern conflict,
Economic sanctions.
the invisible war.
Sanctions are absolutely the centerpiece of this strategy. They get marketed to the public as peaceful pressure. A clean, bloodless, almost humanitarian way to get a country to change its behavior without having to send in the troops.
But that's just the marketing. In reality, sanctions are economic strangulation. They're designed to systematically dismantle an entire nation's economy.
And that causes mass suffering for ordinary people. And that suffering is not an accident. It is the entire point. It's calculated.
So let's talk about the specific consequences. What happens on the ground when these sanctions hit?
Well, the sanctions target the key financial arteries. That leads to a massive currency collapse. They cut off a country's access to the global financial system, freezing its assets abroad. So you can't get U.S. dollars.
And if you can't get dollars, you can't buy things on the global market.
Exactly. So that leads directly to critical shortages of medicine. You can't buy pharmaceuticals, you can't buy medical equipment, you can't even get insurance for the shipments.
And that extends to everything, food included.
Absolutely. Food scarcity becomes widespread. Infrastructure starts to crumble because the government can't import spare parts for the power grid or the water treatment plants. The entire quality of life is just eroded systematically.
And the intent here is to create so much widespread public desperation that the people are forced to turn on their own government. Not because they disagree with the ideology, but because they need to survive.
And this is where the whole thing enters this cynical propaganda feedback loop. Maybe the most disingenuous part of the whole process.
The feedback loop.
The goal of the sanctions is to cripple the economy. Once that happens, once you have the food lines, the failing hospitals, the blackouts, the same people who imposed the sanctions, then point to that chaos.
And say, see, look how badly their system failed.
Exactly. They claim it proves the inherent failure of socialism or resource nationalism or whatever the target ideology is. They joke the system, then declare that the resulting collapse is proof of the regime's incompetence.
There's another great analogy for this. It's like slashing someone's tires, pouring sugar in their gas tank, setting the hood on fire, and then standing back and saying, see, this car is just unreliable.
It's a perfect analogy. The collapse is presented as a purely internal failure, when in fact it is the direct, intended, and successful result of external economic warfare.
And this economic strangulation, it's not a standalone policy. It's part of a very predictable, step-by-step playbook for regime change.
A playbook that we've seen used time and time again.
So what's step one?
Step one is media framing. You have to systematically build the narrative that the target government is illegitimate, that it's criminal, that it's a threat. You use those flexible excuses, drugs, human rights, to build your moral case.
Step two is the imposition of sanctions. That's when you start the economic strangulation.
Step 3 is internal destabilization. This means funding opposition groups, using intelligence assets to stir up unrest, encouraging capital flight to make the economy even witchier.
Then step 4, the official expression of concern. International bodies start issuing warnings, which ramps up the political pressure.
And then comes the critical move. Step 5, opposition recognition. This is where the external power just unilaterally picks a winner. They choose some opposition figure and declare them the legitimate leader, even if they have no real power or popular support.
And the final step, the ultimate act of hypocrisy. Step 6, acting shocked when chaos happens. After doing all of this to cause a systemic collapse, they express profound dismay that the country is now unstable and use that instability as the justification for even more intervention.
And the textbook example of Step 5 of opposition recognition has to be the case of Juan Guaido.
Let's just run through the facts of that situation because
Okay.
it really highlights the audacity of the move. You had a man who, based on a very debatable interpretation of the Constitution, just declared himself president in the street.
And he was instantly recognized by major world powers.
Instantly. But the reality on the ground was that he was largely unpopular, he was unelected to that role, and he controlled nothing. Not the military, not the government buildings, not the territory.
This wasn't some organic democratic movement being supported.
Yeah.
This was a strategic imposition. It was an act of pure geopolitical audacity, just deciding from the outside who the leader of a sovereign nation is supposed to be.
Based entirely on their willingness to comply with those external demands about resources and finances.
Exactly. It sends a powerful message to the actual government.
Mm.
Your sovereignty doesn't matter. We are willing to completely bypass your democratic process to get what we want. The whole apparatus, sanctions, framing, opposition recognition, it's all designed to just exhaust the nation until it finally gives in.
Which brings us to the big logical question. If Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, and the motive is clearly resource control, why wasn't there a direct military invasion? We've seen it happen before, like in Iraq in 2003.
That is the pivotal question for any modern geopolitical analysis. And the simple answer is that the global cost-benefit analysis for a direct invasion has fundamentally changed since the early 2000s. It's just too expensive, too complicated, and way too risky now.
The world is not structured in a way anymore that lets a major power just roll into a resource-rich country without facing severe, lasting consequences.
Let's break down those constraints. First, you've got the immediate international backlash. A direct military invasion would trigger massive global condemnation. It would delegitimize the intervening power. It would alienate allies. It would be a diplomatic disaster.
But there are more powerful constraints now, right? New power structures.
Yes. You have to look at the BRICS nations. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Yeah.
They represent a significant and growing economic and diplomatic counterweight. A military move on Venezuela would get a strong, coordinated response from that bloc.
And then you have the individual big players who are watching this very closely. Let's start with China.
China is watching for two main reasons. First, they are heavily invested in Venezuela. They hold billions in debt. They have these massive oil for loan deals. An invasion puts all of that at risk.
And the second reason?
More critically, China sees any unilateral military action for resource control as setting an incredibly dangerous precedent for them. Their whole foreign policy is built on the idea of non-interference.
Yep.
A successful invasion of Venezuela dramatically raises the risk profile for places they care about, like the South China Sea.
Then there's Russia.
Russia has diplomatic and military technical cooperation with the Venezuelan government. An invasion would be seen in Moscow as a massive escalation of global tensions. It's a direct challenge in a region they see as strategically important. Their response would be swift and likely destabilizing somewhere else in the world.
And beyond all the geopolitics, there's just the raw economic reality.
Absolutely. An invasion in a country with the world's largest oil reserves would cause instant, unpredictable chaos in the energy markets. Oil prices would spike, potentially causing a global recession that would deeply harm the economy of the country that did the invading.
And finally, you have the domestic constraints. People at home are tired of long, expensive wars.
When you add all of that up, the global backlash, the BRICS, China, Russia, the oil market chaos, and the domestic opposition, the conclusion is pretty clear.
Economic exhaustion is the preferred strategy.
It is cheaper, it is cleaner, and most importantly, it's deniable. It achieves the same goal, crippling the state until it complies. But without the tanks, the body bags, and the immediate globally televised accountability.
The strategy is just to starve the system until the internal pressure gets so bad that the government either collapses or caves, allowing the outside powers to come in later and present themselves as the saviors.
The saviors who are there to clean up the mess they engineered.
So as we wrap this up, it's really important to bring the focus back to the human cost. But to look at it through that strategic lens, we have to acknowledge that the Venezuelan leadership made serious mistakes. No government is perfect. But we have to distinguish between internal failures and externally engineered suffering.
That distinction is everything. The extreme suffering of ordinary Venezuelans, the food shortages, the lack of medicine, that's not just an accidental side effect of bad policy. The evidence argues forcefully that this suffering is being leveraged.
Leveraging suffering. That is an intensely cynical phrase.
Yeah.
How does that calculus of desperation, actually work?
Well, the cynical calculation is that economic collapse creates desperation. And when a population is desperate enough, when their survival is on the line every day, their willingness to accept radical, externally imposed solutions goes way up.
So they become willing to accept things they would never agree to under normal circumstances.
Things like foreign ownership of their nationalized oil assets. Things like allowing foreign corporations to retake control of their industries, replacing their currency with the US dollar. Agreeing to stability deals that are dictated from the outside. The suffering creates the political pressure to force compliance with the original demands.
The strategy is to make things so unbearable that the nation itself begs for a rescue. And that rescue package just happens to contain all the things you wanted in the first place.
Corporate dominance,
Yeah.
resource access.
And this isn't just about Venezuela. If we zoom out, the real goal here is to protect the global system by making an example out of them. It's about preventing an alternative model from succeeding.
Correct. This is the danger of precedent. What happens if Venezuela, despite all this pressure, somehow succeeds on its own? What if they keep control of their oil, reject the IMF, and actually thrive?
That outcome is seen as completely unacceptable.
Because the precedent it would set is far too dangerous for the established order. If Venezuela succeeded, resource nationalism could spread like wildfire. Other nations in Africa, Asia, Latin America might get inspired to try it themselves.
It could weaken the dominance of the dollar. It could shrink the power of multinational corporations.
So, Venezuela's struggle becomes this high-stakes test case. It's a critical battle over the future of global economic power.
Which brings us to what you called the unfunny joke of geopolitics, when the official story is all about drugs, democracy, or human rights.
You have to remember the true drivers are almost always oil, independence, and the unforgivable sin of disobedience.
Because at the end of the day, geopolitics isn't really about morality, it's about power. And in this equation, oil isn't just a commodity.
Oil is power.
So we come back to where we started. This whole deep dive has been about a quest for honesty and how we look at the world. And the core message is pretty stark. Geopolitics is about power and asset control. The morality is almost always a strategic tool. The official explanation is the mask.
And the framework for you, as you watch world events unfold, should be to always look past that mask. When you hear the official justification for any kind of intervention, you have to ask, what is the underlying strategic asset here? What is being contested? Is there a critical resource at stake? Is a country rejecting the financial rules of the game?
Because history shows us one thing with stunning consistency. When they tell you it's about drugs, democracy, or human rights, it's usually about resources. It's about who owns the wealth and who makes the rules. You have to keep that lens sharp.
And that's the real thought to leave you with. Question every official explanation you're handed. Because the first casualty of any geopolitical conflict, whether it's economic or military, is always the truth about why it's really happening.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.